All right, this is the fifth edition, so we're just going to play a little more of this clip, and then we carry on with where we left off. We're going to get into explaining about the correct judicial system. So let's just see a little more video first.
I'm just letting you know we come back again, you're all going to be arrested.
Yeah, that's fine, mate. We don't. If you can't tell, we're not afraid anymore.
All right, so let's get into what did I want to bring? Our correct constitutional judicial structure as outlined by British law or constitutional law. So this is a system we were meant to have if we were living in the correct system that we agreed to as a people well before Australia was became a colony of Great Britain. So as you can see here, you have a convener. So if you remember that previous slide, which I'll just bring up. So we'll just go back. If you look at the judicial, so it says court de jure. So court de jure is Latin for of law. So a court of actual law, not of legal, not of legislation, which is what we have now. Jury of 12 and convener. So if you remember that, now we go into the slide again, and I'll explain it, how it works. So here you have your convener, all right? Today, that's what we call a judge, but the convener is different as to what a judge does, is all they do is they are responsible for the smooth proceedings of the trial by jury to happen, right? That their job is to make sure that everything happens as it's meant to, nothing else, right? So then you've got the jury, right? So there's 12 here, you can see, 6 on top, 6 on bottom. They're just selected from here, from the community, just randomly selected. That's our constitutional system, right? Just randomly selected people from the community that become jurors, a jury of 12, because there's someone who's been accused of whether it's a crime or an offence. Of crime, it's because it's to do with there being a victim. If it's an offence, then it's something to do with legislation, right? A breach of legislation. So in this trial by jury, there's two things on trial. It's not just the accused, it's also how just the legislation is, right? So these jury, they're instructed to actually judge out of conscience, right? So they're asking themselves questions like, you know, what would I do if I was in such a situation, right? How would it be for me? How would I react? They're asking themselves questions like that, you know, like what's happening here? Is it fair that they're even here? They're the sort of questions they're asking themselves, right? As if it's them in the shoes of the accused. And so if it turns out that whatever the accused is brought before the jury, if the jury brings back a not guilty verdict, it means that they have established that whatever it is that they're here for has, in their minds, in the jury's minds, has not occurred due to malicious intent. That's pretty much what they're looking for. Guilt is pretty much if they can, you know, have that proof that there's been malicious intent in the actions of the accused. If there hasn't, then it's turned not guilty, right? Because in British constitutional law, why it's so respected across the world is that the most important thing is that a free man remains free. That's the most important. Less is important whether a guilty man remains free, because the way natural law works is that'll catch up to them, right? People will know who they are and what they've done. And just the system of dynamics that's built into the universe is that life is not going to be that wonderful for the guy or the woman who's walking free, but has acted out of malicious intent. So that's why that's less important, and it's way more important and of highest priority that an innocent man or woman walks free. So that's why that is their instruction, right? So let's just say 12, out of the 12, one of those jurors just can't bring themselves to say it's guilty, right? And the other 11 can, right? Then the verdict remains not guilty. That's just the power of one juror, is they all have to be convinced. It's not like this jury trial stuff that we have, see, there's a difference between jury trial and trial by jury. Jury trial is still the corporate system where there's a judge in charge, but it's just a jury that's brought together to decide on whether it's guilty or not guilty. And they all have to be in agreement. There can't be any sort of, can't you have your own opinion, you know, separate? Like until they come into agreement, they're just locked in a room until they do. Like, how's that for coercion, right? So eventually it just wears them down and someone capitulates. Like hardly justice in my opinion anyway. Where a trial by jury is everyone is independent of each other and they all have to be unanimous, otherwise it's deemed not guilty, right? And so if it's deemed not guilty even by one juror, then the legislation that brought them there, if it was a breach of legislation, for example, that comes on trial. You know, that's the part that a lot of people aren't aware of, right? So before I go any further, I'm just going to go into what democracy is not, right? Because this is, we're taught that we live in a democratic country. So democracy is not suffrage, which means voting in elections, because that leads to totalitarian communist fascist states. I don't think I need to say any more as to where we are right now, right? We just never knew it. Same thing like referendums, mass voting, that's not democracy. Same with the legislatorial voting by representatives, the people that we elect to represent us, that they vote on legislation, that's not democracy, because suffrage creates consensus politics. So a lot of people, I'd say, who've been saying we live in a democratic country, I'd be willing to bet have no concept of what actually democracy means. So now let's look into what democracy, the actual meaning of it, where it came from, right? So it's come from the Greeks, the word demokratia. I don't think I'm doing that word justice the way it would be pronounced correctly. Demokratia, maybe. So that comes from the word demos, which means the people, and kratos, which means sovereignty. Now, I did do a lot on sovereignty earlier, so hopefully that information is stuck. And another version of kratos is kratian, and that means to rule. That means the sovereign rule. So the word democracy, you could say, is that the people rule. So it's derived from the Hellenic Athenian constitution. I think it was, I can't remember that. Something BC, it was 800 and something BC to memory. Don't quote me on that one. So it's government by trial by jury. So they govern themselves through trial by jury. So what happens is when the actual people that are put into that position of being an office holder, when they put out legislation, it's tested through the trial by jury system. And if it fails, it's deemed as unjust. That's actual democracy. That's how the people have control over the government. That is our British constitutional system, right? And we've not known it in this country since day one, well before it was even established as, you know, a country. We've never had it. And it's never been here. Like, we don't have any trial by jury system here whatsoever. And then, so what it is the sovereignty of the individual citizen juror as the final arbiter of law. So there is your definition of what democracy is right there, is that the individual juror is the final arbiter of what is law, right? And legislation, if it doesn't actually fit within the confines of doing no harm, creating no loss, you know, keeping the peace, or not committing fraud, it cannot be law. And the people are the judges of that. That is democracy. And that's the information that we don't have, right? And that's why we've let so much happen to us, because we're totally unaware that it exists. So let me just bring up what democracy is. Just in a quick definition, right? Democracy is giving people the power to annul government-made law or legislation in trials run by juries of the people. That's it in a nutshell. So there you have what democracy actually is. Now, how many people can actually say they've known that, right? Up until just recently, I didn't know that myself, right? I needed to look for it to find it. But all the information's there if you want to find it. You just need to be willing to be open to finding it. So let's go into a definition of a democratic person. To protect the innocent from arbitrary government, the democratic person uncompromisingly insists and requires ordinary citizens as jurors in trials by jury to have the final say and control over every act of law enforcement. And just let that sink for a moment, right? It's really, really important, that we have the power to decide and have the final say and control over every act of law enforcement. Who are the law enforcers? The police. But we have the say over it. Now, is that really happening in that video? Is that anywhere close to it? This is just how far removed these men in costume are from the actual role that the people granted them authority to carry out. And that's only been able to continue through the ignorance of what is there. So I'm going to leave it there for this one, and we're going to carry on in the next one and give this a little bit more definition.